Firstly, thank you for being here. This is truly the graveyard slot. I did a not dissimilar presentation only a few weeks ago at this lunchtime seminar. So this is rather than just straight repeating the presentation, this is the kind of editorial version of that presentation. Okay, so they've covered some of the ideas, but actually I wanted to kind of move this on. And where this notion came from is some years ago, I had a doctoral student that phoned me up and said they were interested in looking at this whole area of knowledge and knowledge management, and in particular, how knowledge gets created. And whilst I'm quite interested in how knowledge gets created and shared and whatever have you, actually what was kind of starting to interest me is this notion of how do we actually destroy knowledge, okay? How do we get rid of it? And I think it might link into some of the things you were talking about, Aida, just a few minutes ago. So what I want to do over these next few minutes is really just make my case for destroying knowledge. And I guess this is not, everybody must be fairly familiar in terms of a knowledge life cycle, okay? So where do you think most of the academic interest is when it comes to this area of knowledge and knowledge management? And which one of these phases do you think? Create, yeah. Transfer, yeah. Sharing, transferring, yeah. All right, let me ask the question another way. Where do you think the least amount of interest or academic focus is? This is a search I did on ABI just a few weeks ago. These are the numbers of articles that are published. Sorry? It's disposal. Nobody ever looks at this area of disposal. Everybody's really focused on all of the other phases, but this area of how do we actually get rid of knowledge is one that's barely touched, okay? And even if you look at those few articles that talk about the fact that we need to destroy knowledge, even those articles end up not actually talking about the destruction of knowledge. What they actually say is we need to do it, but actually all we really need to do is find better ways of storing it somewhere, okay, not actually kind of getting rid of it. So what was occurring to me is we needed to deal with something around getting rid of it. And the reason, and here's my premise, okay, here's the argument. The reason for me why we need to kind of get rid of this area of knowledge is because knowledge gets in the way of change. So the proposition I kind of want to argue here is that knowledge is really one barrier to change. And I'm talking about both tacit knowledge and explicit knowledge. So in some of the things you were presenting a few minutes ago, Ada, where somebody says, but this is how we do things around here. Here are our processes. Here are our procedures. Here are the things, here's how we deal with customers, or here's how we deliver our products. All of that knowledge very often is the very thing that prevents people from saying, actually, that knowledge was relevant in a certain context at a certain time. The context has changed. The situation has changed. Actually, maybe we need to let go of some of that knowledge. And yet there are no processes. There's no way of starting to think about how we let go of this knowledge. Okay, and so for me, knowledge, I'm coming from a change management perspective, knowledge for me is a barrier to change. And let me kind of run this argument past some well-known models for change, okay? So I guess everybody's familiar with Lewin's model of change. Yes? So let's take this phase here of unfreeze. I mean, if I overlay Kotter's 8 stages, his HBR article and book on the 8 kind of drivers for change and what are the things that really matter, well, a lot of what he's talking about is actually shaking up the organization and kind of loosening up the organization, creating a burning platform, creating getting people to recognize that there is this real need for change, creating the case for change. Well, very often it's those very cases of change and that very need for change actually comes up against all of the knowledge that exists in the organization. So let me give you an example. I was doing some work with an oil company, okay? These guys made their money from drilling oil, and what they found was that they were hemorrhaging cash, like something like $20 to $30 million a week in cash was exiting the organization. So a group of senior managers from the organization and some external consultants went away to rethink how this organization was going to work in order to stem that flow, that outflow of cash. They created the presentation, they called a meeting of the main board, and they started the presentation. And I wasn't in the room, but I've heard it from the guy who was doing the presentation, who I got to know very well because of all the other work I was doing for them. And he said, by the time I got to my third slide, the MD said to me, he said, switch the projector off. It was like, I was only on my third slide. And everybody had kind of gone through the deck of slides that he had prepared. And so he switched the projector off, and the MD said, sit down for a minute. And so he sat down for a minute. And he said, you've been working in the company for about 15 years now, but as I've gone through your slide deck, what becomes clear is you don't understand the business. In fact, you don't seem to understand the industry at all. Because this case for change that you have made doesn't accord with anything that I recognize, doesn't accord with anything that I know about the industry and anything that I know about this business. You can create the burning platform, which was a phrase they were using in an oil company. I thought that was a bit unfortunate. You can create the burning platform, but if people have a set of tacit and explicit knowledge that does not accept that burning platform, then quite frankly, this whole area of change ain't going to happen. If I bring it into our context today, we all have heard that the industry, our sector, is going to go through some huge change. That requires us to reorganize and restructure. But actually, as some of the questions that came out, if you were at the Vice Chancellor's presentation the other day, one of the questions was, why do we need 3 little units? Why don't we just have one and call it a university? So you can begin to see that some of the things, that case for change is bumping up against those things that we know tacitly, those things that we know from an explicit knowledge point of view. Actually, do we really need this change? Do we need it now? So for me, tacit and explicit knowledge kind of gets in the way of change. Here's another little model of change. I could run the same arguments again in terms of, deal with the current state, and all of a sudden you've got a situation where everybody gets so embedded in the current state they never quite get to the future state. The change never really happens, okay? So, here's a quote from one of the articles that talk about having a knowledge destruction capability where we can eliminate pieces of knowledge, frequently targeted for destruction, professional behavior and organizational routines. How do we get rid of this professional behavior? How do we exit the organization of these routines? But it's very difficult to destroy knowledge. So how do we actually do it? So here's the beginnings of my little contribution to this discussion. I'm interested in the use value of knowledge, okay? So this is knowledge in use as opposed to this high, conceptual view of knowledge. And that's kind of time over there. And what I want to suggest is there's some sort of external event, something happens either outside or very often inside the organization that requires the organization to begin to recognize that maybe the knowledge that we have may not be relevant, okay? And actually, if that knowledge isn't relevant, so what are we going to do about it? There's some sort of reaction, whatever that reaction happens to be. And maybe at some point we begin to recognize that actually, the use value of this knowledge is really not what it used to be. And even then, there's no guarantee that it's going to go. But at some point, we've actually got to remove it from the organization, okay? So what I want to suggest is, if I take that life cycle and take in particular that bit which is removing knowledge, then for me, getting rid of knowledge needs that kind of process. However, every once in a while, we might actually find that there's a way of renewing this knowledge. So thinking about it from a life cycle point of view, it may be that some knowledge can be renewed and continued on over time, okay? So here are what I want to suggest are some patterns of renewing and removing knowledge. So on one hand, think about an organization that says, yep, we've been hit by something, we're not quite sure what it is, we recognize there's a problem, we know that this knowledge is no longer used, and by golly, we're going to get rid of it one way or the other, okay? a very short period of time, so look at the distance from over here to over there, very short period of time we were able to get rid of it. Very different from that organization that says, yeah, we recognize it, let's continue it on, let's hang on to it till the bitter end, and then when we really, really have to, when we're over the edge of the cliff, then we'll get rid of it. Again, very different to one organization that kind of is really almost a vertical drop. Something happens, let's forget and move on. Let's start all over again. So what I want to suggest to you is there are different patterns, and depending on where organizations are in their patterns, so it potentially will affect their ability to change. And clearly, there are some times where we recognize something's gone wrong, but we can renew our knowledge and actually incorporate it into the future. And here are some of the tactics. If we start to think about explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge as kind of two separate things just for a minute, for argument purposes, then here are some of the areas. Explicit knowledge is usually encoded in systems. Tacit knowledge is usually embodied in people. And so that there are some ways in which we can start to get rid of what that knowledge is. And I don't know if you heard on the radio today, but the EU are having a big discussion on the right to be forgotten. You heard about this? So what they're now talking about is, given the internet, given Google, given Facebook, we as individuals have the right to be forgotten. So, as some guy in Austria, in fact, discovered, Facebook had 1,227 pages of information on him. And he said, I don't want to be on Facebook anymore. I don't want Facebook to know about me anymore. So the EU are now looking to pass a directive, which is, they're saying we need a way of getting rid of explicit knowledge. Because this knowledge is out there and it's on Facebook and it's all there. Now, how do we know when Facebook has actually deleted all that stuff about any one of us? And that's just Facebook. So this whole notion that we need to somehow find ways of getting rid of knowledge permanently, completely out of organizations, I think is just starting to kind of warm up as an area. So some final thoughts. I don't think everything ought to be preserved. I think we need to find ways of removing it and doing it proactively. And that's my argument in terms of being a barrier for change. Not many people have looked at this area, so for me, there's a lot of research that can be done here. And we need some methods, we need some tools and techniques. So for me, this is an area that's just kind of getting going. There you go.